How's everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to dig into great theories of everything to help you out with your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. We present out of the way cosmologies and theories of everything, grand unified theories, also magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries. And most of them emanate from obscure sources. We try to go very, very deep on subjects that you probably don't know anything about. But in a way that introduces the subject and then, gets you further and further into it. This is our 246th video that we've done concerning the Reciprocal Church, which is the name that I'm using to give tribute to Dewey B. Larson and his reciprocal system of theory, which is, I think, the most thorough theory of everything that's out there, a unification of all the sciences, all the major fields of science, and a unification of science and religion. And so we use that as a foundational stone for our Reciprocal Church, along with many other spiritual, so-called components of other people's, lifetime work. And so we've looked at a number of alternatives, and now that we have kind of stated the alternatives, we now have to demolish the old system that consisted primarily of the Western religions, in particular the biblical religions, and we're working on the New Testament right now. And I think a deep dive, really any type of deep dive into the New Testament will reveal to you that the New Testament was written by the Romans. It is a psychological operation, or a form of psychological warfare that the Romans used to fight against the Jews, who they were fighting in this event called the War of the Jews, 66 to 73 AD. But there were skirmishes and insurrections and revolutions for over a century before that. And so the Romans decided that, we can beat the Jews in a war, which they did, but it would be just better off to not have to do that and to mellow them out, get them over all of their separatist religious philosophies, and get them to assimilate to our empire. And so what they did is they proposed a Jewish hero and savior who believed in turning the other cheek, and who identified as a Prince of Peace, and a person who believes in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to walk an extra mile with a Roman soldier's backpack, and to call a Roman centurion slave owner the greatest faith in all of Israel. And so on. And so they figured out how to do this. And, the Romans were very much into word games and puns and riddles and mocking. And they were masters of psychological warfare. This is not the first religion that they created, and it wasn't the last either. And this was done during the Flavian dynasty of Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, father and his two sons, from 69 to 96 AD. Vespasian and Titus were also the main generals in this war against the Jews. So what we're doing now, what basically they decided to do was to have the Gospels written in Rome at the court of the king or the emperor, and distribute it to the the masses there in Rome. And so they're written in Greek, which should be a very big red flag right off the bat. If you believe in if you believe in the Gospels, the being written in Greek doesn't really add up. But even if it does, you really have to kind of compare the Gospels with the work of Josephus. Josephus was known as a historian, but he was originally, according to his autobiography, was originally a general for the Jews, but then surrendered to the Romans, had an epiphany, and defected to the Romans. Gave Vespasian a prophecy that said, I foresee that one day you will become emperor. When Vespasian did become emperor, he honored Josephus by getting him out of his POW situation and bringing him to Rome with him as a member of his family, adopting him into his family. That's why he's known as Flavius Josephus. And he was given like a villa there in Rome to live in, where he lived for many decades after this. And he wrote some of the most important books, so-called, in all of Western civilization, including War of the Jews, which came out in the mid-70s, and Antiquities of the Jews, which came out in the early 90s. And he also wrote his autobiography and another work called Against Appian, but I believe it's in his autobiography that it's called the Testimonium. This is the only first century document by somebody who is not a writer of the New Testament to actually corroborate the existence of Jesus, to mention Jesus by name. And that's because he's a Roman. All of the people who mention Jesus by name are also Romans, such as Tacitus and Suetonius and Pliny and Trajan. They were all very, very, very close to the Roman throne, if not on the Roman throne. And we are looking at the work of, so the basic idea is, if you read Josephus' War of the Jews at the same time that you read the Gospels, it becomes abundantly clear that they were written by the same authors and at the same time. And what you generally have is you have the Gospels that are backdated by 40 years. So written in the 70s, but set in the 30s and early 30s. And in the Gospels, what Jesus predicts is going to happen is fulfilled literally by Titus in Wars of the Jews. And a lot of the things, though, however, go the other way, where Josephus is being parodied by the Bible. So you can't say that one was written before the other. They had to have been written at the same time because they speak to each other. And the work here of Michael Menescot's proves that abundantly. What he does is he dug through these two books and found the parallels between the book of Luke and the Jewish War, or War of the Jews. And he found 250 parallels. It's over 10 per chapter of Luke, which has 24 chapters. And Wars of the Jews has approximately exactly 694 paragraphs. He plots all the points of parallels with Luke on the vertical axis and Josephus on the horizontal axis. After plotting the 250 points, he gets the image that you see on the thumbnail for this video, meaning that whoever wrote it, whoever was so-called Josephus, signed their name to the book of Luke. So Menesgotz, Michael Menesgotz, the author here, Menasgotz, in his new book called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. He goes through all these parallels, analyzes them, finds them for you, because sometimes they're very well hidden. Sometimes you can see them, sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes it's not. And there are some tricks that you can use to find more of them. A lot of times when Josephus kind of goes off on a tangent, that's where the parallels are, where he sticks to the history, telling the story. He's usually, that's not where the parallels are mostly going to be. They're going to be in kind of offhand comments and things that you wonder why he even said that. And so we're going to go through some of these parallels here that we've been following here for a month or so. This one here is from Jewish War, paragraph 652, book 7, chapter 2, paragraph 1. Simon, now this is the Simon who is one of the Jewish leaders, one of the kind of the generals for this ragtag army of the Jews, who really had three separate leaders, Eleazar, Simon, and John. And they spent way too much time fighting against each other, according to Josephus. Okay, Simon rises out of the ground from his subterranean cavern and is caught and kept to be executed before Titus at the conclusion of the triumph. Okay, the triumph is when after the Romans win the war, they march back to Rome and they rape and plunder. They show what they've raped and plundered, and they execute everybody who was against it, and they put up monuments and stuff like that. That they call it triumph with a capital T. So he was executed before Titus at the conclusion of the triumph. Now, moving forward 10 paragraphs, it says, the Jewish temple, in essence, the heart of the religion, the Jewish temple was burning and thus had it quenched with water. And Simon was brought to Titus. Okay, so they quenched the fire of the temple, and then Simon was brought to Titus to be executed as part of the triumph. And Simon rose out of the ground from his subterranean cavern. Now, if we go to the book of Luke from chapter 22, verses 31 to 33. Simon, now this is the disciple Simon Peter, I believe. Simon will be given to Satan to be sifted as wheat. And Simon said he was willing to go to prison and death. And now moving to Luke 24, chapter 24, verse 32, they said, didn't our heart burn within us and return to Jerusalem, saying, the Lord appeared to Simon? Okay, let's see. There are parallels, clearly. There's Simons in each story. There's controlling something like a possession. Simon came out of the subterranean caverns and was caught. In the second passage in Luke, he is given to Satan to be sifted as wheat or judged. And Simon said he was willing to go to prison and death, meaning he was willing to be executed, which is what he was there in Rome to do, to be executed before Titus at the conclusion of the triumph. And then he says, didn't our heart burn within us? And returned to Jerusalem, saying, the Lord appeared to Simon. In Jewish war, it says the Jewish temple, which is the heart of the religion. So that's the heart of that is burning within Simon, the other Simon. And thus it had quenched with water, and Simon was brought to Titus. And in the Luke, it says the Lord appeared to Simon. That is something that occurs in many of these parallels, where the Lord and Simon the Lord and Titus are equated, or God and Titus are equated. Okay, now, last but not least, the following sequence of parallels between Jesus and Titus is presented, I guess, concludes with the scene of Titus and Vespasian's famous triumph parade. Having considered returning to Rome separately to save two triumph parades, the Flavians decided instead to pool the resources and have the mother of all victory parades, with a vast quantity of multi-story displays and huge quantities of gold and silver, all fed and towed by vast numbers of soldiers and slaves, all flowing through the streets of Rome for most of the day, and culminating with the traditional public execution of their captured enemy general. Instead of executing Josephus Flavius after he surrendered, General Simon was dragged along at the front of the parade until they reached a famous site which was named for a skull, place of the skull. I thought that was Golgotha. I think it is. Which is all expertly parodied in Jesus' story in Luke, with further relevant detail added later in Revelation. Now, sometimes you do have to know information from other parts of the Bible to be able to see some of these parallels. That's why Menescott's work is useful, because he kind of knows what the code is, and so he's able to show it to you. Because once you see it, then you can't unsee it. But sometimes it's right in front of your face, but it's still quite hard to see. Okay, now we're starting a set of parallels here that he just talked about. There are a number of different parallels. These are fairly long passages, although we should be able to finish it here today. Okay. This is Jewish war paragraph 663 to 665, book 7, which is the final book, book 7, chapter 5, verses 4 through paragraphs 4 through 6. Vespasian and Titus pooled their resources for a monumental procession in Rome. Early, they came out crowded with laurel, crowned with laurel, and clothed in purple robes. I'm looking for the end of his parentheses. I just want to leave that out, but he left a lot of, he doesn't actually have an end of the parenthetical. Okay, let me just read it. Which only emperors could wear. Okay, there's the end. Which only emperors could wear, the purple robes. And went to the governors of the city, for a tribunal, where the troops gave attestations of their valor. The Praetorian Guard would implicitly have been a key part of the triumph. They gave a feast involving all the men and paraded to be seen by the multitudes. And the parade involved great numbers of captives, including women from Galilee, following and watching them. The parade was truly vast, with huge parade floats, troops, displays, etc. And rather than merely be a pompous show, it was, as one may say, running along like a river. Now, while he says, Menescott says, whilst unstated in Jewish war, the first century reader would know that Titus and Vespasian were later deified as gods. So the river extends from two gods located at its head down the middle of the main streets of the city. The huge riches displayed included immense quantities of gold and silver that they plundered from the temple. Also, a vast number of transparent precious stones were carried along. The key monument it passed through was the gate of the pomp, which all triumphs must pass through. And this giant stone gate straddled either side of the great parade, which had murals, images, leaves of a sort sculpted on its sides. The procession reached the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus for the enemy general to be slain, that's Simon. This building was named after a skull discovered in its foundations, and it is tradition for the triumphator there to be offered but refuse wine. Roman law required that malefactors be executed at the end of the parade. The Jewish general chosen was Simon, son of Gioras, who had been dragged in the triumph with a rope. They waited in silence, and when Simon had died, all the people offered a shout for joy. Okay, now we move over to the book of Luke, and trying to get a little bit of traction here. It's pretty hard to obviously see this. It's in I had to take pictures of the pages, and the book is, you know, it's very hard. It goes over the curve, and so you're looking at things that are pretty distorted. It's basically my lack of photography skills. Okay, this is Luke chapter 23. The multitude arose and led Jesus to the governor. There they arrayed him in a purple robe and put a crown of thorns on his head and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knee, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." They led Jesus to the hall of judgment, known as the Praetorium, and they called together all the men, and it was early, and they had a feast. And as they walked, Jesus said that the huge number of men and women following them should be weeping in sadness for their own misfortune. And all the women that followed him from Galilee watched. Now, he's got to throw in this part from Revelation, chapter 22, verses 1 through 3. The angel showed a river of the water of life. It was clear as crystal. Crystal meaning precious, transparent stones. This river extends from two gods, located at its source down the middle of the main street of the city. On either side of the river stood a tree of life. So this has the shape of a city gate, and the leaves of the tree gate are for the healing of nations. Now going back to Luke chapter 23, starting with verse 26. To Jesus they offered him wine, which he refused, and they laid hold upon him, Simon, and made him bear Jesus' cross. And they came to Calvary, or Golgotha, the place of the skull, and crucified him with malefactors executed next to him. The centurion, a Roman, said that certainly Jesus was a righteous man, and all the people that gathered to see smote their breasts, a practice of Roman soldiers when giving attestation. Okay, so there were a number of parallels there. See what he has to say. One reason these two parallels are so obvious is because of the extra detail provided in Revelation, which was written after the Synoptic Gospels. So the author of the original story is trying to be subtle so that nobody would notice parallels that weren't disclosed to them. But later authors decided to be bolder and can see the parody more starkly thanks to their works. The parallels with Luke are almost too obvious to comment on, and the river in Revelation is already known by scholars to potentially evoke a procession through a city. Notice that the comparison is between the triumph in Rome and the crucifixion of Jesus. In many, many of the different parallels, the Jews are treated as a disease or a sickness, and killing them is treated as healing. So in this case, the celebration, the triumph of the Romans is the parallel of the destruction of Jesus. Okay, while the story had to align with the Pauline literature, which mentions Jesus' crucifixion, now Menescot's is, I think, making a mistake by assuming that the Pauline literature is legitimate, whereas the Gospels are not. That's because he thinks that the Pauline literature was written before the Gospels, which is a very shaky assumption that's based on absolutely nothing except for the fact that the Paul literature does not refer to the books, the Synoptic Gospels or John, and so they figured that he would have if he could have, but he didn't know about them because he was writing before them. The evidence is much better that the Pauline literature was written by Pliny the Younger, and the rest of the New Testament was written by other members of the family of the Pisos, who were kind of the back door, behind the scenes emperors of the Flavian dynasty, and really all the dynasties after that. So continuing, Pauline literature, which mentions Jesus' crucifixion, the story of Jesus' procession to his death, down to the name of its location, the place of the skull, is entirely a parody of the Flavian triumph procession. So in this case, the Bible is parodying War of the Jews. So if you think that it's because Josephus was written later, that doesn't fit here. They were written at the same time. This mother of all parades led to the public execution at the Capitoline, a building whose name, capit meaning skull, was based on a skull found when it was being built. According to Josephus, scholars have long noted that Jesus being given a purple robe is astounding. Purple was not only the color of the emperor, but also required a specific dye made from mollusks, which cost more than gold by weight. In that era, purple robes were as costly as a ship. Similarly, being offered and refusing wine, wearing a crown of leaves, receiving attestations from the Romans, and the reference to the praetorium are all well known to be symbols relevant to the Roman emperor. So those are all in Luke. So Luke is parodying this whole procession. A Christian might argue that this all makes sense because God is trying to show that Jesus was to return, transfigured in white, as both our deity and as King of the Jews, and in that perhaps they aren't wrong. Okay, he got more to say, and so we'll say it with him tomorrow when we return. Thanks for tuning in today.